Differences between experimental group and control group. Experimental group versus control group. Experimental group is the group that are conducting experiment, whereas control group is the group that you are not conducting experiment. The purpose of experimental group is to receive the interventions being tested, whereas the purpose of control group is used as a comparison to the experimental group. The sample size of experimental group is large enough to provide statistical power, whereas the sample size of control group is large enough to provide statistical power. The experimental group mainly receives the treatment being tested, whereas the control group receives no interventions or a placebo. The randomization of experimental group is selected randomly from the population being studied, whereas the randomization of control group is selected from the population being studied. The analysis of experimental group is based on statistical analysis which is performed to compare outcomes, whereas the analysis of control group is based on statistical analysis which is performed to compare outcomes. The researcher is changing the independent variable that he thinks will influence the dependent variable, whereas the researcher is not changing the independent variable or set it as a standard value. Null hypothesis is rejected because there is a significant differences in the dependent variable, measured or observed, of experimental group and control group, whereas null hypothesis is accepted because there is insignificant differences in the dependent variable, measured or observed, of experimental group and control group. A good experimental group is identical to the control group in all ways except for the differences in the experimental condition, except for the variable that is changing in the experiment. Whereas a good control group is identical to the experimental group in all ways except for the differences in the experimental condition, except for the variable that is changing in the experiment. Experimental group allows researcher to find the effectiveness of a new treatment or procedure, whereas control group allows researcher to isolate and measure the effect of the experimental treatment while all other variables are unchanged. Experimental group helps in identifying side effects of the treatment on the subjects, whereas control group helps in finding the causal linkage between dependent and independent variable. The pros of experimental group are many, such as it provides clear evidence regarding the cause and effect linkage between variables and it enables researchers to validate their finding and test hypothesis. Whereas the pros of control group are many, such as it provides a basis for valid claims about the effect of the experimental treatment and permits for more accurate and reliable study results. There are many cons of experimental group, such as can be affected by confounding variables, which may render results unreliable or inaccurate. The treatment may not have a significant effect, which would mean that resources and time are wasted, and ethical consideration may arise as some experimental treatment may cause harm or discomfort to participants. Whereas there are many cons of control group, such as the use of a control group may increase the cost, time and resources needed to conduct the experiment. The control group may experience changes due to factors other than the experimental treatment, leading to invalid results. The control group may not accurately represent larger population being studied, leading to biased results, and the control group may present ethical concerns as it inherently denies some participants the opportunity to receive the experimental treatment. In short, in experiments, scientists compare a control group and experimental group that is identical in all respect. Whereas, unlike the experimental group, the control group is not exposed to the variable under investigation. It provides baseline which any changes in the experimental group can be compared. Kindly subscribe my YouTube channel Thesis Helper. Thanks for watching.